My name is Rachel Calderara. Again, I am the Outreach and Education Manager at Wildlands Trust. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about us in case you don't already know about our organization. We work throughout southeastern Massachusetts. We're a regional nonprofit land trust for the area. So we permanently protect farmland, native habitats, lands of high value, either ecological or scenic value. We do this to keep our communities healthy and our lands healthy and our residents connected to the natural world. Our service region here encompasses over 40 towns throughout, again, that's the area of southeastern Massachusetts. We don't go any farther beyond that. And we have about 10,000 acres in protection in those towns. So that is the primary function of Wildlands Trust, is to protect land. And then additionally, once we have it, we have to take care of it. So we have a whole stewardship department that is dedicated to maintaining trails for people, for wildlife, keeping them safe for visitors. And we do keep all of our preserves open to the public. In addition to that, we have educational events, community engagement programming. That's kind of where I come in as the outreach manager. We also have a lot of youth programming and opportunities for youth across the region. And I always like to give a nod to the towns, nonprofits, and state agencies throughout the region that we collaborate with across all of our departments that make our work possible. So right now, we are in the last 5 days of our fiscal year at Wildlands Trust. So we are in the last 5 days of our spring membership drive. And that means that if you join between now and June 30th at a $50 or higher level, which would make you a member, then your gift is matched by a one-to-one matching gift that we've received. So you can double your impact by joining now or renewing if you've already were a member last year. And we really hope that you do. We're almost at our goal, so we would really appreciate your help in reaching our goal this year. Another small nod to our healthcare workers that we're doing right now before the end of the year is to give a free one-year membership to any healthcare worker in your life. So if you become a member, you'll get that information in the mail and you can give that membership to somebody in your life. And as always, 100% of your support goes towards what we do, the protection and stewardship of land. So I want to welcome you to tonight's program, which is Shorebird Identification with Brian Harrington. Let's see if I get the introduction right this time. It is Thursday, not June 18th, but June 25th, 2020. We are take 2. Brian is a wonderful presenter. We're very lucky to have him. He's the author of The Flight of the Red Knot. He is on the board and the Lands Committee at Wildlands Trust. He worked at Manomet for, I'll let him say how long because I messed it up last time, 25 plus years. He was a biologist at Manomet right in Plymouth. And he currently serves as the president of the Harringotn Watershed Association. I'm going to hop off here and turn it over to you, Brian.
Okay.
All right.
So I would like to make one little correction, and that is that I'm the past president of the Harringotn Watershed Association. And so now I get to sleep a little later every day. This program really is an outgrowth of something that I helped work with at Manomet when I was there, and it's now being managed by Brad Wynn. And the idea of the program was to work with wildlife refuge managers and natural area managers across the country to give them ideas of how they could manage lands that they might have a different focus on, maybe for waterfowl or something of that nature, how they could manage those lands for shorebirds during shorebird migration. And so part of the 4-day workshops, sometimes 5-day workshops, part of it was teaching people how to identify shorebirds. And so we were basically working with people who did not know much about shorebirds. And so the program is we get into all the species, but the idea is to give clues on how to identify shorebirds. So that's the focus of the talk here, is identifying shorebirds in New England. I just want to back up a little bit and thank everybody for their patience. My computer actually died during the first attempt at this back on the 18th. and the computer doctor came and he declared it unworkable. And so my new computer is arriving tomorrow, and meanwhile, I'm using Martha's computer, my wife. So a shorebird, some people would logically think a shorebird is any bird that you might find on the shore anywhere. And that's really not right. We have on coastal areas, we have shorebird, we have terns, we have gulls, things like the black skimmer here, or ospreys, or herons. This is a heron from the southeast. This is a reddish egret. And then we have the true shorebirds. So I sometimes refer to shorebirds as the wind-up birds that go up and down with the waves at the beach. And a lot of people can relate to that. The field guides that you would have for identifying shorebirds really can give you ideas of what one might look like in breeding plumage or in winter plumage, and often they don't give you ideas of what the birds might look like when they're in plumage and so forth. Just to give you an idea of how similar shorebirds are, this first slide is a flock, I think in Florida maybe, a flock of birds on a beach, and there's 8 species of shorebirds in this slide. So we'll torture you with things like this a little later. For now, I want to just get into how to go about identifying shorebirds. A lot of people feel they're impossible. They're not. So they come obviously in a lot of sizes and shapes. Here is one of our larger shorebirds, an oyster catcher or a long-billed curlew. This is from the southeastern US. And here's one of our smaller species, in this case, at least sandpiper. And so they come in a huge variety of sizes and shapes. And the best way, if you're a novice with shorebirds, the best way to come to an identification is to work through the various shapes and sizes and narrow down the options as you start trying to focus in on what this shorebird is out in front of you on the beach. So things to pay attention to include size, the structure of the bill, the body length, the body shape, feathering, legs, patterns of how the bird is, the feathers appear uniform? Do they have a scaled appearance maybe on the back, or are they complex? And you also want to pay attention to the habitat that the shorebird is in. That can often give you a good clue as to what you're looking at. And then the behavior. And we'll talk more about these things as we go along. So the body size, I suggest that you try and figure out whether the shorebird out in front of you is large, with a body size larger than a pigeon, or medium size, body size about robin size, or small, the body size about sparrow size. And of course, there's some in between, but for the most part, you can categorize a shorebird in front of you as large, medium, or small. And then you want to pay attention to the bill shape on this shorebird that's out in front of you. And is it straight? Is it narrow? Is it stout and thick? Is it upturned, downturned? What are the features of the bill of the shorebird? And then pay attention to the head shape. Is it a large head? I often refer to the plovers as football players. They've got a big head and a short, thick neck and a fairly stout bill. Or does it have a smaller, relatively speaking, relative to the body size, a smaller head and a bill that's longer, as long as the head or longer than the head, maybe a tiny bit shorter, but not a stout bill as you would find in a plover. This last group are various kinds of this shorebirds. There's a dozen what we call tribes, and we'll get into that a little bit. So if the shorebird out in front of you has a body, a thick neck, and a big head and a big eye. It's almost certain to be some kind of a plover here in New England anyway. And so your first question is it a plover? Your second question is it a big plover or a small plover? And once you answer that, you can go on to look at just the large plovers or just the small plovers. So we have two kinds of larger plovers here in New England. One is relatively scarce. This is the golden plover, American golden plover. And we don't see very many in New England, but if you do, it's an exciting find and something to be happy about finding. Our more common large plover, body size bigger than a robin, is the black-bellied plover, which has a very stout bill. It has a fairly indistinct cap as compared to the golden plover, which has a fairly distinct cap. And there's some other differences we'll get into as we move through some photographs. So a black-bellied plover in the breeding plumage, which this is a very dapper-looking bird. Has the very black breast and belly. Sometimes it can be a little bit flecked rather than solid black. Has a scale-colored black and white or brown and white in the back. And one feature of a black-bellied plover is the very white undertail area. And actually the belly on a bird is way back there. So I sometimes flippantly call this the white-bellied plover. But in any case, the black-bellied plover in breeding plumage has a very distinctive white undertail cover. Here's a black-bellied plover again in the breeding plumage, but here's what they can look like in, let's say, late August or early September, kind of a halfway between breeding plumage and wintering plumage. Here's one in the wintering plumage. And so they don't always have that characteristic solid black neck and upper breast and lower breast. This is a juvenile black-bellied plover, and I won't go too much into telling adult from juvenile shorebirds, but the reason I put this in is that, excuse me, that it has a kind of a golden colored flecking in the back, a brownish golden, and a lot of people think that they are seeing a golden plover when they see the juvenile black-bellied plover. But remember, it's got the light color undertail here. It's also got the stout bill, and it doesn't have a distinct capped appearance. It can be a little more capped than this individual looks, but it's not a distinct capped appearance. Oops. Here's a golden plover. And a golden plover, again, you see the dark undertail, no white undertail. It has a thinner bill, and it has a more distinctly capped appearance. And in this plumage, it's got some nice, distinct golden colored flecking in the back, which you don't see so much in the black-bellied plover. It's also a finer flecking than you might find in most black-bellied plovers in breeding plumage. And here's the juvenile golden plover. Note that the lower belly and the undertail are more or less the same color. It's not a lighter white color as you would find in the young black-bellied plover. And the distinct capped appearance and the fairly, the lighter bill than the black-bellied. So here's the two together. The black-bellied up here, pasted in on the upper right. And again, light undertail, heavier bill, doesn't have the distinct capped appearance. So these are the two together. So if your plover was smaller than a robin, you have one of the small plovers. And you can divide those into two groups, the ones that have brown backs and the ones that have gray backs. Right, so your first question with smaller plover is gray back or brown back? Now with the brownback, you basically have two choices. One is the semi-palmated plover, which has a single black band around the breast. It's usually found in coastal areas, but can occur in non-marine places also, but much more common in coastal habitat. And then you can have the killdeer, which also is brownback and has two black breast bands. The gray plovers, the gray plovers here in New England are really, the small gray plovers are piping plover. We don't have any other small gray plover. We do in the southeast, but not here in New England. So the killdeer, probably everyone on this call knows the killdeer, and named for its call, which sounds like kildee, kildee. I can't quite do it. But anyway, two black bands on the breast and then the brown back. This is bigger than the semi-palmated plover, but it's still body size. It's almost a robin, maybe a little bit smaller than a robin on the body size. And here's the semi-palmated plover, shorter bill, single black band on the breast. Leg colors are different between the two also. Okay, so here are some plovers and some sandpipers, which you ought to be able to pick out. The plovers have the big head, the very short neck, and the short, stout bill. Whereas the sandpipers generally have thin bills, smaller relatively to the body, smaller head, and more flecked in the back. They're not a solid brown like the semi-palmated plover here, or here, or here, which are solid brown in the back. So the sandpipers typically are a little bit more flecked in the back than are the plovers. So the piping plover is our only small grayback plover here in New England. It's been controversial, as most of you probably know, because it's endangered, and Plymouth has done a really good job after years of work of protecting this bird on Long Beach, Plymouth Beach, which is maybe one of the best nesting areas for piping plover in the northeastern US. We have a high success rate of the piping plovers here in our Plymouth beaches, especially Long Beach or Plymouth Beach. They feed on worms. Sometimes they can have a little tug of war, which is always amusing to watch. Here's piping plovers in the winter, okay? And compared to the breeding plumage, where the features are fairly distinct, in the winter plumage, the facial features and the bar and the breast are less distinct. We usually don't see wintering plumage piping plovers here in Massachusetts, but you will on Florida beaches or even in the Carolinas or Georgia. And those of you who are really sharp will notice that one of these piping plovers is color banded. It has a little white band on the leg, and so this is very exciting to scientists. When we find our color marked birds, we can spend a long time trying to read the color band, whether it's white or blue, whether there's 2 or 3 of them, and which one is on which leg, and so forth. And very often, we can figure out the exact individual bird that's represented. This one, of course, has one leg pulled up, so we wouldn't be able to do that. But still, very worth reporting piping plover, even if you see just the colored bands on one leg. So the plovers were the big-headed guys with the short, thick necks. Sandpipers generally, smaller eyes, smaller head, and a longer, thinner bill than plovers have. So that's the general characteristic of almost all various shorebird groups. There's a whole bunch of different types of sandpipers. We call them tribes, and I'm not going to go into that. a lot, except to divide them up for identification purposes. So this is a picture from the southeastern U.S. Or maybe California, I'm not sure, but it shows large shorebirds, and in this case, you can see slightly upturned bills on these marble godwits, and a long downturned bill on this long-billed curlew. And so bill shape and size immediately leads you to identification of these two birds. And bill body size, I meant to say, and bill shape. So the godwits have slightly upturned bills. Sometimes you need your imagination to see that it's upturned. Sometimes the upturn can be very subtle, but usually it's fairly conspicuous, and the size of the bird, body size bigger than a pigeon, puts you into two groups right away. Well, if they're brown, two groups right away, the godwits and the curlews. So here's a marble godwit, one of our larger shorebirds, and a sanderling, which is one of our smaller shorebirds. So you can see there's a good deal of body size difference among the shorebirds. Here's another picture of large shorebirds, basically two large ones. This picture is not from New England because here's a boat-tailed grackle in the background, and we don't have those. But the reason this picture is here is we've got two that are brown with slightly upturned bills, and we've got two that are grayer, and the bills are fairly straight. And so we've got two different kinds of birds here. You can tell right away by the body size and by the bill shape. So these are two willets, and these are two marble godwits. This is the laughing gull. And I think these are gull-billed terns in the background. Okay. This is another kind of godwit that you would have trouble finding in almost any state in New England, except in the fall anyway, except Massachusetts. We are one of the few places where you can go and expect to see, at the right time of year, expect to see a Hudsonian godwit. And nowadays, that's pretty much it at Monomoy Island on the elbow of Cape Cod. In the spring, they show up in Texas and Louisiana. We don't really see them here in New England in the spring. In the winter plumage or the juvenile plumage, it's basically gray. It doesn't have the brown plumage in the back and this nice brick-colored undercolor. The bill, though, is bicolored, and that's characteristic of Hudsonian godwits at almost any time of year. Another large shorebird, body size bigger than a pigeon, and downturned bill. This is a bird I grew up calling a Hudsonian curlew, but today we call it a whimbrel. So it is a kind of curlew, but its name now is just whimbrel. Downturned bill, conspicuous eye stripe, flecking in the back, as is true with many of the sandpiper groups. And it's a long distance migrant that we see here in August, well, July, August, and September. It's unusual here in the spring. Just a nice photograph of whimbrels taken by Brad Wynn. Nice surf in the background. Another group of big shorebirds are very conspicuous, the oyster catchers with their bright red bills, or it might be half red and half black if it's a young bird. But the characteristic black above, white below, with a red bill, orange eyes in the adult, a little less brightly colored eyes in the younger birds, but oyster catcher. Oyster catchers were rare here in New England when I was a kid, but they have come back and are now reoccupying the range that they once held back in the 1800s. But they were extirpated by hunting and by egg collecting in the late 1800s, here in New England, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And now they're just coming back over the last 25, 30 years. It's nice to see. These are all large shorebirds. And if you're looking carefully, you'll see oyster catchers, of course. Those stand right out. But then we have some gray ones with fairly straight bills. Those are willets. We'll talk more about willets in a bit. And then you have a whimbrel here with a downturned bill. And if you're sharp, you'll find another whimbrel in here. Three different kinds of large shorebirds that we would find in New England here. So the willet is in the group of shorebirds that we call tattlers. And so there's maybe 6 or 8 different kinds of shorebirds in the tattler group. Willet is one, yellowlegs are another in the tattler group. And so the willet is large, it has a straight bill, which is it's not decurved, doesn't have any real features about it except that it's a lighter blue near the base and dark out at the tip. Fairly plain gray in the fall plumage, which this is, and gray legs, grayish blue or gray legs. So willets also are moving back into New England after having been extirpated here. And it's now a regular nesting bird on places like Duxbury Beach or Monomoy Island or a lot of the marshes on Cape Cod. And so they are coming back. Willets have this striking white stripe in the wing in flight. Again, pay attention to the bill here and pay attention to the leg color. Okay, because tattlers can be hard to tell apart when they're standing in the water. We have 2 kinds of willets here, 2 subspecies. We have what are called the eastern willet and the western willet. Western is a little bit bigger than the eastern, a little bit more gray in the plumage. We don't see many westerns until August, and then they start showing up. And by August, our eastern willets, which are our nesting willet, basically are starting to move out towards their wintering range. Excuse me. 2 other tattlers are the greater and lesser yellowlegs. And the take-home message here is they can be very difficult to tell apart. In general, the lesser yellowlegs has a bill that's about the same length or maybe 1 1/4 times the length of the head, this being the length of the head, whereas the greater yellowlegs has a bill that's usually 1 1/2 or more the length of the head. There's some other differences that stand out if you happen to hear them. The greater yellowlegs has a fairly shrill tooting call. It's not so much a tooting, it's a cry, three notes. Whereas the lesser yellowlegs has a softer call and usually 2 notes. I can't imitate it. So the bill length on the lesser is about 1 1/4 the length of the head, as I said. It's also a finer bill than the greater yellowlegs. But there is overlap. And if you look at this carefully, you'll see this is a fairly short-billed greater yellowlegs, and this is a fairly long-billed lesser yellowlegs. And the bills are almost, they're pretty close to each other in length, but this is a finer bill. So here we have a yellow legs with the bill a little bit longer than the head, not much longer than the head. This is the lesser yellow legs. Lesser yellow legs also has a proportionately smaller head as compared to the body than does the greater yellow legs, most of the time. So with what I've said, you probably know that this is going to be a longer billed yellow legs, a greater yellow legs, and a heavier bill. Otherwise, looks quite similar. It's a little bit bigger bodied than the lesser yellow legs. So if you have the two together, that will help you separate them. Or if they're standing next to a dowitcher or some other shorebird, you can gauge the size of the body and figure out whether it's a smaller yellow legs or a bigger yellow legs. But often that's hard to detect. And the bill length relative to the head is often the most useful little tool you can have. And the call if you hear it. This is another bird in the tattler group, which is really different than the other tattlers we have. And this is our spotted sandpiper, a common autumn migrant here. Also, it shows up in the spring, especially in farm ponds and non-marine habitats. We have them in marine habitats also, less commonly, but they can show up on beaches especially. And sometimes they'll nest in the dune grass on our Cape Cod beaches or in Plymouth or Duxbury. Here's another more typical tattler with a longer shank or upper leg, and as compared to the spotted sandpiper, which has relatively shorter upper legs. But the rest of the tattlers, the yellow legs, the willets, and this bird have a relatively longer upper leg, which is typical of most of the tattlers. Prominent eye ring in many of the tattlers. This one isn't the yellow legs because it doesn't have yellow legs. It isn't, and it's actually smaller than the yellow legs. And this is a solitary sandpiper, most common in freshwater, quite unusual in saltwater habitats. It often bobs its head up and down like a spotted sandpiper would do. And like a yellow legs will sometimes do, but these are more apt to be teetering, as we say, in their, at the edge of a farm pond or in some nice freshwater habitat. When they fly, they have prominent white tails with lateral black bands or black marks on the tail. Another solitary sandpiper, greenish yellow legs, prominent eye ring, spotted, speckled back, bill size about the same length as the head, a little longer maybe. Here's another group of shorebirds, another tribe, which are the dowitchers. And a lot of people feel that you can't really tell dowitchers apart. You can, but it takes a lot of practice and a lot of experience. We have two kinds, the short-billed dowitcher and the long-billed dowitcher. And of course, with those names, you would think you could tell them apart by one having short bills and the other having long bills. Doesn't work that way. There's a huge overlap in the length of bills between short-billed and long-billed dowitchers. The longest-billed dowitchers are fairly distinct, and the shortest short-billed dowitchers are fairly distinct, but the 80% in between are hard to tell apart by bill length. And we'll talk a little bit more about other features as we go along. Note that this has sort of a tubular shaped bill, and it's drooping a tiny bit out near the tip, which is usually the case in the short-billed dowitcher. So here's another dowitcher in the foreground with a tubular-shaped bill, slightly downturned. Look in the back here, and there's another bird that's feeding along with the dowitcher, a little bit out of focus, but that's okay. And look at the shape of the bill on this bird versus this bird. Very different shape. This is a calidrid sandpiper of some sort, and it has a bill that steadily tapers from the tip to the base, and it tapers at a steady rate from the tip to the base. Whereas the dowitchers and many of the other sandpiper groups have bills that do not taper at a steady rate from the tip to the base. So this is more tubular, and it only gets thick as you get near the base, but it's not tapering out near the tip. So this is a short-billed dowitcher, and behind it is a stilt sandpiper. We'll talk about them a little later. So how to tell long-billed from short-billed? Look, first of all, at the angle line up the bill and back across the head, and then you drew an angle up to the eye, you would have an angle here that's called the laurel angle. Okay? And the laurel angle is greater on the short-billed dowitcher than it is on the long-billed dowitcher. Well, this is getting into detail. I often urge people to just call it a dowitcher and be happy. But if you want to work on dowitchers, there's some papers and some things you can find on the internet that go into more detail than I want to get into tonight in the talk here. But that's one feature, and the result of the difference in laurel angle is that the eye appears to be higher on the head in the long-billed, in the long-billed than, lower on the head in the long-billed and higher on the head in the short-billed dowitcher. So this is a long-billed dowitcher. If you draw a line up the bill and then up into the head, it comes pretty close to where the eye lies. And so that eye is fairly high up on the head. Whereas in the short bill, which we'll get to in a minute, in the short bill, the eye will appear farther above a line that you draw up the length of the bill and onto the head. So short-billed dowitchers in the breeding plumage tend to have more barring back here on the flanks, whereas short-billed would be more spotted back here. The long-billed dowitcher has wider black, black bands in the scapular feathers back here than does the short-billed dowitcher. And well, those are breeding plumage differences between the two. As they go into winter plumage, they become the same color, and that becomes harder to work with. So this is the short-billed dowitcher, pretty close to breeding plumage on this one. And note, instead of bars back here, it has spots. That becomes a less distinct difference as you get into the late fall. But in the spring and early south migration, that can be a useful feature. Again, short-billed, the bill is slightly drooping near the tip. Draw a line up the division of the bill and onto the head, and the eye is falling well above that line as compared to what you would see on most long-billed dowitchers. Excuse me. So another short-billed dowitcher getting in towards winter plumage. Again, you can see the bill. It's very slightly drooped. The eye is placed up fairly above the line you would draw going up the gape of the bill, from the gape of the bill. So I made it sound as though they're pretty distinct, distinctly different, and when you put them together, they're not. Here we have a long-billed dowitcher in the foreground, fairly straight bill. It's not drooping very much. The angle coming up from the bill is close to the eye, the line, whereas in the short-billed dowitcher, if you draw a line up from the gape in the bill, the eye is relatively higher up on the head. Drooping bill. The barring here is disappearing. This is a bird starting to go into winter plumage. We can't see the scapulars on the short bill to compare them here, but the black barring in the feathering of the scapulars is wider and bigger in the long-billed dowitcher than it is in the short bill. So the bird I talked about earlier, the stilt sandpiper, it's a calidrid sandpiper, and you can tell because the bill is tapering at a steady rate, base to tip. The stilt sandpiper is usually gray when we see them here in Massachusetts, rather than this pretty spring plumage where they have the distinctive russet cheek patch and all this distinct barring. So we'll see them sometimes sort of halfway in this plumage, halfway between this and the winter plumage. And the winter plumage looks like this. Not very distinct looking, but the behavior, wading in water like a dowitcher and probing like a dowitcher, is fairly characteristic of stilt sandpiper. They tend to probe at a sharp angle down into the bottom. A yellowlegs or a pectoral sandpiper, some other sandpipers might be pecking things out of the water column and not going down to the bottom. So you can tell the bottom is a good distance away from the legs here. So the stilt sandpiper tends to probe all the way down to the bottom. Around the edge of freshwater marshes, we might find a Wilson snipe, fairly distinct with the white lines below the eye, as well as the traditional eye line above the eye that we see in many other birds. So it's the medium-sized shorebird, maybe a little bit bigger than a robin, but certainly not getting up to pigeon size. Very similar to dowitchers in shape, except they have a relatively longer bill than dowitchers. But they have very different behavior than dowitchers. Here's two Wilson snipe together. Another sort of fresh, or a not marine, not aquatic shorebird is the woodcock. Many of you go out to see woodcocks in their flights in the spring, in late March, early April, in some nice fields here in southeastern Massachusetts. Eye placed way up on the head so they can see behind when they're probing. They probe for earthworms and other things in the soil. And so this is a legally hunted shorebird in New England, along with the snipe that we looked at in the last slide. But those are the only shorebirds where it is now still legal to hunt them. All of the others were taken off of the hunting list back in the around 1920, 25. One of our brighter colored shorebirds here in Massachusetts is the ruddy turnstone, which in the breeding plumage, which this is this nice calico pattern in the back with the harlequin pattern on the breast and black and white and these nice ruddy colors. Beautiful little shorebird. It's our only shorebird with bright orange legs. As you get into winter, the legs are still orange, maybe not quite so bright. Here's a winter plumage. Ruddy turnstone still has that fairly striking pattern on the breast of black and white below. And still in this example has some of the calico pattern in the back, but not much of it left now in this individual. So this would be winter plumage, and we only see them scarcely in the winter here in Massachusetts. A bird I know fairly well, the red knot, is another calidrid sandpiper. Going back to the turnstone, it's not a calidrid sandpiper. Note that it has a wedge-shaped bill rather than the steadily tapering bill, of the red knot, which is a calidrid sandpiper. So the red knot's a medium-sized shorebird, about the same size as your dowitchers, but obviously with a shorter bill, roughly the length of the head or a little bit longer in the red knot. A beautiful bird in the spring and breeding plumage, but as you get into the winter plumage, it's not anywhere near as striking. So plain gray. In the winter, it's one of the most nondescript shorebirds we have. As you can see here, they're bigger than a sanderling, which is one of our smaller sandpipers, quite a bit bigger than a sanderling, about the body size of a dowitcher. The color gray in the back is a lighter gray than you would find in a dowitcher. Another medium-sized sandpiper that we have is freshwater mostly, which is the pectoral sandpiper. We see them rarely in the spring, mostly in the fall, in July, August, and getting into September. So this is the pectoral sandpiper with all the little brown lines coming down the neck and onto the breast and ending fairly sharp at a fairly sharp line going across the breast, which is the pectoral girdle. And so they get their name, pectoral sandpiper, from the fact that these lines all come down and stop together at about the level of the pectoral girdle. Freshwater. Brown rather than gray of the red knot. Pretty fancy bird to find during south migration. We can also sometimes find buff-breasted sandpipers during south migration. That's a lucky day if you find one. Usually not on a mudflat, but up on the higher parts of our beaches, sometimes foraging in the seaweed that's accumulated above the tide line that's full of little amphipods, or sometimes in shorter grass areas of the salt marsh where the pickleweed might be growing, or where there isn't tall, dense grass, but sparse grass along the edge of a pan. Fairly large-eyed. It's not a calidrid sandpiper, but it is in the sandpiper tribes. They migrate all the way to Patagonia. This is the sanderling. What I often tell people is the wind-up bird going up and down with the waves at the beach. In the winter plumage, quite gray. One of the distinct features of the sanderling in flight is the white stripe that comes all the way down the wing to almost to the tip. Some of our other small sandpipers will have a fainter white wing line that comes partway down the wing, but not the whole length of the wing, almost the whole length. So the sanderling is one of our most abundant shorebirds on the coast. It's rare and uncommon at non-marine locations. And here's the sanderling in the breeding plumage, highly variable plumage. Very often mistaken and misidentified for something else. Compare the size here to a small calidrid sandpiper, a semi-palmated sandpiper. Excuse me. Very often with this nice rufous coloration, but sometimes not having the rufous coloration in the spring. So sanderling. Another larger of our peep sandpipers, which are the small sandpipers, is the Dunlin with its little downturned bill, its black tummy, and beautiful reddish colored or russet colored back. Way back it was called redback sandpiper, but now it's known as Dunlin. And it's a pretty common shorebird here in the spring and in the fall and right on through the winter. So it's one of our, a bird we can expect to find in the right habitats during the winter. Not many shorebirds we get in the winter. Here's a Dunlin in its winter plumage. Not very distinct in coloration or pattern on the plumage, but the bill will occur, the downturned bill, of course, identifies it as a Dunlin. Here's a Dunlin with one of the smaller peep sandpipers. And when I use the word peep sandpiper, that's basically saying it's one of the very small kinds of sandpipers, sparrows, a little smaller than sparrow-sized body. Whereas the Dunlin is a little bit bigger, still a calidrid sandpiper, but a little bit bigger than the others. So the bill shape here is quite different. Excuse me. With the this peep sandpiper having a shorter bill relative to the headlight and fairly straight, might droop a tiny bit, fairly straight bill. So we have some sandpipers that are in the smaller group that we hunt for and are lucky to find. This one, the white-rumped sandpiper, is a fairly regular migrant here in south migration and also found in the spring. And the giveaway clue on a white-rumped sandpiper as compared to our more common semi-palmated sandpiper or least sandpiper, the giveaway clue is the fact that the wingtips extend. Here's the tail, and this is the tips of the wing extending maybe half an inch or an inch beyond the tip of the tail. We call that wing extension. So white-rumped sandpipers have a greater wing extension than our other common sandpipers, the semi-palmated and the least sandpiper, and sometimes the western sandpiper. So wing extension is something to look for in the little tiny sandpipers on the beach here in August. And with luck, you'll pick out a white-rumped sandpiper. They also tend to be a grayer color in the back than our semi-palmated and least sandpipers. Here's the white rump, which you typically don't see if the bird doesn't fly in the right direction. And so it's not a very useful field mark unless you go and flush a shorebird that you think might be a white rump. And it's maybe just better to not disturb them and look for the wing extension. And if you still confused, just maybe call it a peep sandpiper and acknowledge that you don't really know what it is and that you don't want to go disturb it to find out. Wing extension. So here are some sandpipers that have, pretty good wing extension. This one has a lot of little flecking along the side here, which is characteristic of the white-rumped sandpiper. Also a tiny bit of red near the base of the bill. Whereas this one doesn't have that little dark flecking. It has a slightly finer bill. You might say that's imaginary, but it isn't. This is a different one. This is something else, but it's got wing extension, okay? So it's not a least sandpiper, it's not a semi-palmated sandpiper, it's something else. So that's a Baird sandpiper. And we'll have a closer look at a Baird sandpiper. And so here's one in the spring plumage. And one of the traits that we often see in Baird sandpiper is the scaly colored, scaly patterned back. And that is because we often see juvenile birds which tend to have a scaly pattern in the back, whereas the adult Baird sandpiper, which are rare here in Massachusetts, doesn't have that scaly pattern. But our field guides tell us about the scaly pattern because what we see are the juveniles. And they do, in fact, have a scaly pattern on the back, wing extension going beyond the tail. The angle here is a little hard to see that very well, but this is a Baird sandpiper. Unusual bird here in New England. Lucky to find one in any given year of shorebirding. Western sandpiper, and this one in spring plumage. Very difficult to tell apart from the semi-palmated sandpiper, which is our most abundant bird, the semi-palmated, our most abundant little sandpiper. Western sandpiper tends to have red scapulars here, which is often a giveaway to help you separate it from the others. This one in spring plumage, you'd have no trouble telling, but we don't get them in the spring to speak of. But if you're in South Carolina and see one with all this flecking, that's a good clue of spring plumage Western sandpiper. Here's one more in the fall plumage, and note that the red red marks up at in the scapular area of the back is fairly good mark for Western sandpiper. They also tend to have slightly lighter cheek color than our semi-palmated sandpiper. The wings usually come close to the tail in length. This one's actually a tiny bit longer, but that's unusual. And here's one in the winter plumage. This happens to be one that has a pretty long bill. It's kind of hard to see that because of the angle here. But bill length doesn't really separate out your Western all the time. So here's some sanderlings with the light gray plumage, and here are some small sandpipers. And in my book, these would go down as peep. I don't know what they are. And so I let them go as peep because I can't see the bill. Here's our most common sandpiper, the semi-palmated sandpiper, bill shorter than the head, well about the same length as the head, sometimes a bit longer. Gray-brown plumage in the back versus brown-brown of the least, which we'll get to in a minute. One of our smallest shorebird, the wings don't extend much beyond the tail at all. Another least sandpiper, notice that the cheeks are a little bit darker than they were on the Western sandpiper a little bit ago. Wing extension is about the same as the tail. Another typical semi-palmated sandpiper. In this photograph, it looks like it has light legs, but that's a piece of grass. The legs are dark on the semi-palmated sandpiper. Here's another semi-palmated sandpiper getting closer to the winter plumage. This is a medium length bill. Sometimes semi-palmated sandpipers will have a bill that comes out much longer, overlapping with Western sandpiper in length. So this is a nearing winter plumage semi-palmated sandpiper. This one looks pretty much like it, but it's a little bit darker, has greenish yellow legs, typical of the least sandpiper, also has more of a bibbed appearance than a semi-palmated sandpiper would have. And that bib goes all the way across the breast, whereas if the semi-palmated sandpiper has any part of a bib, it just goes part way across the breast, not all the way across. So least sandpiper, another least sandpiper, the greenish yellow legs, This one is closer to the breeding plumage, but you still have that bibbed appearance. And you can often tell a least sandpiper from way far away just by the bibbed appearance on the breast. A small sandpiper with a bibbed appearance. In the breeding plumage, nice, rich, beautiful colors on a least sandpiper. Least sandpipers in winter, I know these are least sandpipers because of the leg color. This one I can see the bill on, and so that would give me a clue. Aside from the leg color, not much to tell whether it's a least or a semi-palmated sandpiper. We also have phalaropes in New England occasionally. I'm going to skip over these quickly, but basically the Wilson's phalarope is our most likely one on the beaches. Rare or uncommon, very needle-like bill, often chasing beach flies across a mud flat. And at sea, you might find a red phalarope looking like this in the spring. In the winter, it's gray and fairly indistinct, but it has a prominent white wing stripe, much like a sandling might have, but it's got the needle-like phalarope bill. These are generally pelagic. We don't see them at land except during storms. Here's the redneck phalarope, also a needle-like bill that is typical of the phalaropes. Swimming typically swimming. We don't see them standing on a beach very often. And in the winter plumage, has a fairly distinct pattern up on the back in this very needle-like bill. I'm going to skip upland sandpiper. They've gotten so scarce now that we hardly ever see them. So I'm just going to go through a couple slides that are mixing it up now. Here's a fairly straight bill. It's a kind of a tattler. The bill isn't long enough to be a dowitcher. The body size on this bird is about pigeon size, maybe a little bigger. There's another similar looking one, but it's smaller. This is a willet. This is a greater yellowlegs. Finer bill than the willet has. Here's another willet over here. So two types of tattlers. Tattlers, if they were out of the water, you'd see a lot of upper leg. All right, we'll skip by that, but suffice to say that some people are out counting shorebirds for the International Shorebird Surveys, and something to look into if you decide you want to really help shorebird conservation by going out and doing some counts at a place you adopt. And it might take you an hour to search through and count these shorebirds. No clues here, really. None of the birds. These are all peep sandpipers. Oh, we do have a clue. We've got a slightly bigger one and whiter one over here. That's a sandling, but we don't know if these are semi-palmated or western sandpipers. There's no wing extension, so we know it's one of those two, but we don't know which one. We don't see any of the bib marks I talked about that a least sandpiper would have. So these are either western or semi-palmated sandpipers. Here's a little mixed group of sandpipers, sandling with a light in winter plumage, sandling with a lighter gray back, red knot with a solid gray back and a straight bill, Dunlin with a solid gray back, slightly smaller with a droopy bill. And over here, a couple more sandlings. Here's another red knot, another sandling, more Dunlin and sandling. All right, here's a challenge. We have a black-bellied plover here and two oyster catchers, and then these are something else. And with what you know right now, or what we've talked about, you might have trouble sorting these out. Couple clues. These have greenish yellow legs. And they're too big to be a least sandpiper. They're they're bigger, match them up against the plover or the oyster catcher. These are fairly large. These are medium size. So we might have to just let it go at that. These in the background actually have darker legs. So something's going on. These are dowitchers. And back here, these are Dunlin with their bills tucked in and not showing us. And so, you might just put those down in your little tally sheet as shorebird species or medium-sized shorebirds and smaller shorebirds. Another, what is it? These are medium-sized, right? The leg color here tells us that it's something like a dowitcher or a stilt sandpiper. But without seeing the bills, you might have trouble telling. Dowitcher has a more bulky body than a stilt sandpiper, and also when the bills are tucked in, the back of the head tends to be a little more squared off in a dowitcher. So I happen to know these are dowitchers based on that, and the leg color and the size. I don't know which kind of dowitcher, of course. So in my book, they would go down as dowitcher species, DOSP. All right. I think we'll call it quits at that. And if there's any questions, I'd be glad to try and answer them.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to have you go to stop share so we can come back to see everybody. Here we all are. All right, guys, so if you have a question, what you can do is on the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a tab called Participants. Click on that. That's going to bring up a list of everybody on the call. And on the bottom of that list on the right, there's an icon that says Raise Hand. If you click on that, if you have a question, I will see that you have a hand up and I can call on you. It's a lot easier to do it that way. You can also put questions into the chat. So go ahead. I don't know, maybe we don't have any questions for the first time in program history. Okay, Linda, I can see your, okay. So I'm gonna call on Linda first, and then we have some more hands up. Go ahead, Linda, there you are.
Brian, I was with you about 2/3 of the way through, and then they all started to look the same in the winter plumage. Do you have any tips on behavior or feeding mechanisms? Sometimes if you look at the way they're acting, that helps me because I don't always, not able to see the fine points, especially without a scope. So any thoughts you have on that might be useful.
So I'm thinking Linda's talking about small shorebirds.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the sandpipers. And excuse me, basically we have in the winter, from the Carolinas on up north, we have 5 kinds of small sandpipers. The sandling is the larger of those. It has a lighter gray back, and if it's foraging, it's pretty frenetic. It's just sort of always on the move.
Yeah, that I can tell. Yeah.
Whereas least sandpipers would be much more deliberate in their movement, fairly slow paced. I call it grazing, like a cow would do. And so they're much slower in their movement. A western sandpiper or semi-palmated sandpiper would tend to be in the water, not always, sometimes out on the mud, but tend to be in water, also grazing, also fairly deliberate in their foraging. And so when you get down to that, you're down to the smaller peep. And it's often a matter of just looking very carefully. Look for the bibbed appearance that you might have on the leaves on a western or a semi-palmated, and you can almost discount white-rumped and beards because they're now in Patagonia in the winter. So you might be down to western and or semi-palmated. And in my notes, I have a lot of birds that are identified as seawees. And a seawee, S-E-W-E, is a semi-palmated western. And so my notes are full of seaweeds. And so sometimes it's better to, if you're not sure, it's just better to say, I don't really know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I probably didn't answer your question.
It's a long-term learning curve for sure.
It is.
All right, thanks, Linda. We're going to go to Sam Chapin next. Sam, you can come off mute.
Yep, thank you. I've done a lot more upland birding in the woods and such than I have on the shore. But all of the beautiful breeding plumage birds that you've shown us, particularly the smaller ones with their russets and their browns, my impression is that we don't get to see those here in breeding plumage very often. And I'd just like to know if you can comment on that. Is it because I haven't been out there at the right time, or because we mostly see those birds, you know, in transit before they've developed their full breeding plumage?
So whisper in my ear and give me a chance to talk about migration, and you're in for 3 hours. But basically, yes, we don't see a lot of the shorebirds that are common here in south migration. We don't see them in the spring migration very much. So part of the reason for that is that in New England here, there's not much food. Our mudflats have been cleaned out by fish all winter. They've been cleaned out by shorebirds the previous autumn, and all the invertebrates haven't had much of an opportunity to grow during the winter and early spring. It's not until June and July that they start getting big enough and offer enough food value to shore. So many of the shorebirds, instead of migrating through New England, go north up through the prairie region of our country, of Canada and the US. And there they find gobs of invertebrates coming out in the spring ponds and in the spring marshes of Oklahoma and Kansas and what have you. And they just bypass New England. So many of the species have an elliptical migration pattern where they go up through the Midwest and come back down through the East Coast. And by the time they're coming down, our mudflats are loaded with food. They can really fuel up and get a lot while they're here. So, but by the time they are starting to leave their Arctic nesting places, they are already molting their feathers, which means shedding feathers, and new ones are starting to grow in. And the new ones coming in are the bland, for the most part, bland, gray, fairly indistinct feathers. So when we get them here in August, and this is south migration, autumn migration, so that it peaks in August for most of these birds. By the time we see them here, they're half-baked. They're halfway into the winter plumage. The bright feathers are mostly gone. That's what we get in New England.
So thank you. It's not because I was been missing something necessarily. I would need to go to the Midwest or up to the breeding grounds to see those. Thank you.
Or down to South Carolina or Georgia.
All right, thank you. Our next person up is Sandy. Go ahead and come off mute, Sandy, and ask your question.
Hey, Brian, thanks so much for doing this. Totally fascinating. I feel like a bit of a neophyte in this crowd, but I guess my question is, what's the story with them standing on one leg, pointing into the breeze?
Oh, I always tell people that it's so they can turn with the wind like a weather vane. But the truth is, I have no idea.
Perfect.
So some people say it's to, just have one leg exposed to lose heat from the body. But the honest answer is nobody really has a good scientific answer to why they do that. One year I went out and studied sandalling flocks starting in August on Plymouth Beach, and I carefully counted how many were on one leg and how many were on right legs, left legs, blah, blah, blah. And I did that right on into November, expecting I would have great scientific results. And there was nothing there.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Michael, come on off mute and ask your question.
Hey, Brian.
Hi.
So I know shorebird populations have been dropping over the past 30 years or more, and I just wanted to know which species are of special concern or are being looked at as being especially endangered that we should be thinking about.
Wow. I mean, we have some that are officially on the endangered species list, and of those that we have in New England, that would be piping plover and red knot. But the truth is that a lot of them are declining, a lot of the species are declining at rates that would lead to endangerment within the next 25 years. So we have a lot of our species declining at 6–7% a year. And that's clearly not sustainable. And so there's a lot of work going on to try and figure out why, what's causing this. And you have to keep in mind that you're dealing with birds that nest up in the Arctic, that use migration stopover areas in Massachusetts and maybe in Kansas, Oklahoma, and maybe winter in Venezuela or Argentina. So where do you start looking? And so there's a whole program, mostly run out of Manomet, but a lot of people and other organizations involved trying to figure this out. And it's called the Shorebird Recovery Program, if you want to look for that on the internet. But bottom line, we've been looking hard for 10 or 15 years, and we don't have answers yet.
Thank you, Michael. We have a question in the chat, Brian, from Mariana. She wants to know which of the shorebirds described are also along the mid-coast of Maine.
Well, the most common ones on the coast of Maine would be pretty much the same as we would have here on the coast of Massachusetts. And so I guess I wouldn't make a big distinction between what I described as being around here in the autumn versus Maine. Pretty much the same. You might have more purple sandpipers coming in on the coast of Maine when you get into November, but otherwise I'd say the species mix is pretty similar to what we have here in Massachusetts.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up, and I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I will say thank you, everybody, for coming back and rejoining us tonight. Thank you so much, Brian, for the wonderful presentation, sharing your knowledge, your wealth of knowledge with us. And I will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who registered with, a program evaluation, information about membership, any links, Brian, that you want to share with people so they can continue their education on shorebirds, and all kinds of stuff. So be on the lookout for that email from me. Thank you, everybody, so much, and have a wonderful night. Hopefully we'll see you soon.